You think success means moving off the street? The words cut through the silence of Corwin Dre's penthouse office like a blade. He stared at his phone, replaying the voicemail Zaira had left 3 hours ago. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta's skyline glittered in the evening light. But all he could see was her face, disappointed, hurt, walking away from him. "Mr. Dre?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes." Corwin didn't answer. He was remembering another voice, another moment, the day everything started to fall apart. Billionaire CEO dating street vendor? Love or publicity stunt? The headline had destroyed everything. But it wasn't the media that broke them. It was his silence when they attacked her. His cowardice when she needed him most. 6 months earlier, Corwin Dre owned Atlanta. At 32, he was the city's youngest self-made billionaire, founder of Ember Tech, a data analytics empire that Fortune 500 companies paid millions to access. His name appeared on magazine covers, his opinions moved markets, and his buckhead penthouse hosted the kind of parties that made social media explode. He had everything money could buy. 5 restaurants across the Southeast, a collection of vintage cars worth more than most people's houses, invitations to every exclusive event from Miami to Manhattan. But on that sweltering Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, none of it mattered. Corwin stepped out of his black Escalade onto the shimmering pavement of Peachtree Street, adjusting his Italian suit jacket. The lunch meeting at Aria had been postponed, a rare inconvenience in his perfectly scheduled world. His assistant, Marcus, hurried to keep pace. "Want to grab something while we wait, sir?" Corwin surveyed the bustling sidewalk with distaste. Office workers rushed past, clutching coffee cups and checking phones. Street musicians played for spare change. And there, under a faded red canopy, a young woman stirred a pot of something that smelled like... He paused. The aroma hit him before he saw her clearly. Soy sauce, chili oil, garlic, something else he couldn't identify. Rich and complex and completely out of place on a downtown street corner. The woman behind the cart moved with practiced efficiency, her dark hair pulled back, her hands quick and sure as she served a line of customers. She wore a simple white t-shirt and jeans, nothing remarkable, but there was something about the way she carried herself. Confident, grounded, real. Before we continue this powerful story, I'd like to welcome you once again. Please let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Shout out to our lovely viewers worldwide. Please enjoy today's story. So, this is what people are calling food these days? The words left his mouth before he could stop them, loud enough for her customers to hear. Several heads turned. A few people chuckled nervously. The woman, Zaira, though he didn't know her name yet, looked up from the bowl she was preparing. Her eyes met his without flinching. "You hungry or just bored?" Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, no deference to his expensive suit or the obvious wealth radiating from every detail of his appearance. The small crowd around her cart seemed to hold its breath. Corwin felt his jaw tighten. He was used to people recognizing him, used to the subtle shift in behavior. When someone realized they were talking to Atlanta's most powerful young CEO, this woman showed no such recognition. "I own 5 restaurants," he replied, his voice carrying the edge that made board members squirm. "None of them serve whatever this is." Zaira nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Then maybe it's time you taste something real." The challenge in her tone wasn't flirty or defensive. It was simply honest, as if she was stating an obvious fact he was too stubborn to see. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside him. A few customers exchanged glances. Corwin felt the weight of their attention, the expectation that he would either back down or escalate. He chose neither. "I'll pass." He turned and walked away, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete. But as he moved down the street, something nagged at him. Not embarrassment. He was too proud for that. Something else, something he couldn't name. That night, alone in his penthouse, with its panoramic view of the city he'd conquered, Corwin found himself thinking about the encounter, about the way she'd looked so certain of what she was doing while his own world suddenly felt hollow. He'd built an empire on reading people, on understanding what they wanted before they knew it themselves. But this woman, this street vendor, had looked at him like she could see, right through the expensive facade to something he'd forgotten existed. The scent of her cooking lingered in his memory. Not just the food, but something deeper. The smell of care, of tradition, of something made with hands instead of manufactured in corporate kitchens. For the first time in years, Corwin Dre couldn't sleep. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if everything he'd built was just an elaborate way of avoiding something real. Tomorrow, he would return to that cart. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, he stared at the city lights and tried to remember the last time anything had surprised him. The last time anyone had challenged him. The last time he'd felt hungry. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but Zaira Chen was already awake. She'd been lying in her small apartment above the laundromat on Memorial Drive, listening to the early morning traffic and thinking about her father's hands, how they moved when he chopped vegetables, how they never shook, even when the cancer made everything else tremble. She rolled out of bed and padded to the tiny kitchen, where everything waited exactly as she'd left it the night before. Soy sauce, rice wine, sesame oil. The special blend of spices her father had taught her to mix by feel, not measurement. The recipe that had traveled from his grandmother's kitchen in Guangzhou to this cramped Atlanta apartment. Cooking is conversation, he used to say while she watched him work. You talk to the ingredients. They tell you what they need. Zaira pulled on her jeans and the white t-shirt she'd worn yesterday, then yesterday before that. She owned 7 identical shirts, all bought from the same discount store on Buford Highway. Practical, washable, invisible. By 5:15, she was loading her cart. The portable gas burner, the steel pots her father had saved for 3 years to buy, the plastic containers filled with fresh noodles she'd made the night before. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. The drive to downtown took 23 minutes in her battered Honda Civic. She knew because she'd timed it every day for 2 years, ever since she'd taken over the route her father could no longer manage. The same route he'd worked for 8 years before that, building a customer base one bowl at a time. Peachtree and Ellis, the corner where dreams either died or learned to survive. She parked in the loading zone at 6:45, exactly 15 minutes before the meter enforcement started their rounds. 15 minutes to set up, to transform a folding table and a gas burner into something that smelled like home. The broth was the heart of everything. She'd started it at midnight, simmering beef bones and star anise, ginger and onions, letting the flavors marry in the slow dance her father had taught her. No shortcuts, no instant anything. Just time and patience and the kind of care that couldn't be bought. Morning, Zaira. Janet from the accounting firm across the street was her first customer, same as always. Large bowl, extra cilantro, light on the chili oil because her stomach couldn't handle spice anymore. How's your daughter's college search going? Zaira asked, ladling the golden broth over fresh noodles. 3 more applications to go. I swear this process is harder than my CPA exam. Zaira smiled, adding the perfect amount of green onions. She'll find the right place. Smart kids always do. This was her favorite part, not just the cooking, but the connections. Janet had been coming here for 18 months, ever since her divorce finalized, and she needed somewhere to eat lunch that felt like kindness instead of obligation. Marcus, the security guard from the Wells Fargo building, always ordered 2 bowls. One for himself, one for his diabetic partner who couldn't leave his post. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her grandson every Friday, teaching him to use chopsticks, while Zaira pretended not to notice when he dropped half his noodles. They weren't just customers, they were her community. By 8 a.m., the morning rush was in full swing. Office workers grabbed quick breakfasts before disappearing into glass towers. Construction crews from the site 3 blocks down came for the kind of substantial meal that would carry them through a day of heavy lifting. College students from Georgia State counted out exact change for the smallest bowl, which Zaira always made sure was just as generous as the large ones. You know you could charge more, said David, a regular who worked at the CNN Center. This is better than anything in those fancy places. Zaira shook her head. My father always said food should feed people, not bank accounts. It was true. Even when the rent on her apartment went up, even when the cost of ingredients climbed, she kept her prices the same. $3 for a small bowl, $5 for a large, enough to cover expenses and save a little for the dream she carried like a secret. Her own restaurant, not some corporate chain or trendy fusion place, but a real neighborhood spot where families could afford to eat together, where the recipes her father had protected could feed more than just the lunch crowd on a street corner. She'd saved $8,000 so far. At this rate, she'd have enough for a down payment on a small space in 5 years. Maybe 4 if she was careful. The lunch rush started at 11:30. This was when the real test came. 40, sometimes 50 orders in 2 hours. Her hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding every motion. Noodles into bowls, broth ladled with precision, garnishes added with the kind of speed that came from doing something perfectly 1,000 times. "Behind you," called Tommy, the bike messenger who helped her during the busiest periods. He wasn't officially an employee. She couldn't afford to pay anyone, but he'd started showing up. 3 months ago, organizing the line, taking orders, refusing to accept money for his help. "My grandmother had a place like this in Chinatown," he'd explained the first day, before the developers came. "I know what this means." The afternoon brought a different crowd. Slower, more time to talk. Zaira learned about divorces and promotions, sick parents, and new babies. She remembered birthdays, asked about job interviews, celebrated small victories with extra portions. This was her father's real legacy, not just the recipes, but the understanding that food was love made visible, that a bowl of noodles could be medicine for loneliness, comfort for grief, celebration for joy. At 3 p.m. she started cleaning up. The broth pot went back in the Honda, along with the folding table and the cash box that held the day's earnings, usually around $60 after expenses. Enough to live on, barely enough to dream on. But as she drove home through Atlanta traffic, Zaira felt rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. She'd fed 43 people today, made them smile, made them feel cared for, made them part of something larger than themselves. Her father would have been proud. Tomorrow, she'd do it again. The elevator climbed 47 floors in silence, carrying Corwin Dre toward his kingdom in the clouds. The mirrored walls reflected his image back at him, sharp suit, sharper jawline, the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no unless he was the one saying it. Ember Tech occupied the top 5 floors of the Promenade Building, Atlanta's newest monument to corporate ambition. Glass and steel reaching toward heaven, filled with the kind of people who measured success in quarterly reports and stock options. "Good morning, Mr. Dre." His assistant Marcus fell into step beside him as the elevator doors opened. "The Tokyo call went well. Yamamoto Industries wants to expand their contract by 30%. Corwin nodded, already scanning the tablet Marcus handed him. Revenue projections, market analysis, competitor intelligence. The digital pulse of an empire built on understanding what people wanted before they knew it themselves. Ember Tech didn't just collect data, it predicted behavior. Their algorithms could tell you which customers would cancel their subscriptions next month, which employees were likely to quit, which products would fail before they hit the market. Fortune 500 companies paid millions for that kind of foresight. "The board meeting is at 10, Marcus continued, matching Corwin's brisk pace through the executive floor. "Legal wants to discuss the acquisition terms for data flow, and your lunch at Aria has been confirmed for 12:30. Aria, one of his 5 restaurants, though calling them his was technically inaccurate. He owned controlling stakes in each establishment, had hand-picked their executive chefs, designed their concepts to appeal to Atlanta's elite, but he rarely ate at any of them anymore. Success had a way of making everything taste the same. The corner office was a monument to achievement. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he'd conquered. Awards lined the walls: Entrepreneur of the Year, Forbes 30 Under 30, Atlanta Business Chronicle's Most Influential. His Harvard MBA hung beside a photo of him shaking hands with the governor. But this morning, something felt different, off balance. "Sir," Marcus hovered in the doorway. "The board members are arriving." Corwin waved him away and walked to the windows. 47 floors below, Atlanta moved like a living organism. Cars flowing through arteries of asphalt, people streaming along sidewalks, the constant pulse of commerce and ambition. He'd built this empire from nothing. Well, not exactly nothing. His trust fund had provided the initial capital, but he'd turned $2 million into $2 billion through pure intelligence and ruthless focus. While his Harvard classmates were still paying off student loans, He was buying buildings. The secret was simple: understand what people needed before they did, then sell it to them at exactly the right moment. Data was the new oil, and Corwin had built the most sophisticated refinery in the Southeast. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria, the pharmaceutical heiress he'd been seeing for 3 months. Dinner tonight? The usual place? The usual place was Le Bernardin, where a meal for 2 cost more than most people made in a week. Victoria was beautiful, intelligent, connected to all the right families. She looked perfect on his arm at charity galas and understood the unspoken rules of their social circle. She was also completely predictable. Corwin deleted the text without responding and turned back to his desk. The morning's schedule was packed. Board meeting, conference call with investors, lunch at Aria with potential clients from Chicago. The kind of day that would generate enough revenue to buy a small country. Mr. Dre? Marcus appeared again. The board is ready. The conference room was filled with Atlanta's power elite. Old money and new tech innovators and real estate moguls. The kind of people who shaped the city's future over $18 cocktails. They'd made Corwin rich, and he'd made them richer. Gentlemen, ladies. Corwin took his seat at the head of the mahogany table. Let's talk about the future. For the next hour, they discussed market expansion, acquisition targets, the quarterly numbers that would make shareholders smile. Corwin spoke with the kind of authority that came from being right more often than wrong, from building something that mattered in a world that forgot most things by Tuesday. But his mind kept wandering. To the street below, to the people moving through their lives without algorithms to predict their next move, to the messiness of existence that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets. The data flow acquisition will give us access to retail behavioral patterns across the Southeast, he heard himself saying. We're looking at a 40% increase in predictive accuracy. The board members nodded, impressed by numbers that would translate into bigger bonuses. Better stock options, more zeros in their already substantial bank accounts. After the meeting, Corwin stood alone in his office, staring at the city again. Somewhere down there, people were living lives that couldn't be reduced to data points. Falling in love, losing jobs, chasing dreams that made no financial sense. When had he stopped being one of them? His phone rang. Victoria, again. Darling, you didn't respond to my text. Her voice carried the slight accent that came from Swiss boarding schools and summers in the Hamptons. Are we still on for tonight? I'm not sure, Corwin said, surprising himself. I might have to work late. You always work late. That's what assistants are for. She was right, of course. He had 3 assistants, 2 personal shoppers, a chef who prepared his meals, a housekeeper who managed his penthouse. An entire staff dedicated to making sure he never had to think about the mundane details of existence. I'll call you later, he said, and hung up before she could respond. Marcus knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Sir, the car is ready for lunch. The clients from Chicago are already at Aria. Corwin grabbed his jacket, the Italian wool that cost more than most people's monthly salary. As they rode the elevator down, he found himself thinking about lunch, not the business lunch waiting for him at Aria, with its molecular gastronomy and wine list that read like a financial portfolio, but actual lunch, the kind of meal that satisfied hunger instead of impressing clients. When had he last eaten something that wasn't designed to make a statement? The Escalade was waiting in the building's private garage, its black paint reflecting the fluorescent lights like a mirror. As they pulled onto Peachtree Street, Corwin watched the city flow past the tinted windows. Office workers hurrying to meetings, construction crews taking lunch breaks, street vendors serving food from carts and trucks. Real food, made by real people, for other real people. Sir, Marcus was looking at him strangely. We're here. Aria rose before them, all glass and steel and architectural ambition, the kind of place that charged $50 for a piece of fish because it could, because people like him were willing to pay for the privilege of being seen there. Corwin straightened his tie and stepped out of the car, ready to play his role in the theater of success. But for the first time in years, he wondered what would happen if he just didn't. The call came as Corwin was reviewing the wine list at Aria. Marcus leaned over discreetly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir, the Chicago clients had to reschedule. Flight delays. Corwin looked up from the leather-bound menu, momentarily disoriented. The restaurant hummed with the quiet efficiency of expensive service, crystal glasses catching light, servers moving like dancers, the soft murmur of deals being made over truffle risotto. Reschedule to when? Tomorrow, same time. They apologize for the inconvenience. For a moment, Corwin just sat there. When was the last time his schedule had an unexpected gap? When was the last time he'd had an hour with no agenda, no objectives, no carefully orchestrated outcomes? Should I have the car brought around? Marcus asked. Corwin stood, leaving the untouched water glass and the menu he'd barely glanced at. Let's walk. Outside, Atlanta's summer heat hit like a physical force, the kind of heat that made expensive suits feel like punishment, that reminded you the South didn't care about your air-conditioned comfort zones. Corwin loosened his tie as they walked down Peachtree Street, Marcus struggling to keep pace while checking his phone for urgent messages that couldn't wait. That's when the smell hit him. It wasn't the sterile aroma of Aria's kitchen or the carefully curated scents of his other restaurants. This was something raw, honest, alive. Garlic and ginger, soy sauce, and something else he couldn't identify. Something that made his stomach respond in a way it hadn't in years. What is that? He asked, stopping mid-stride. Marcus looked around, confused. Sir. Corwin followed the scent like a bloodhound, weaving through the lunch crowd until he saw it. A food cart under a faded red canopy, steam rising from a large pot, a line of people, waiting with the kind of patience that suggested they knew something he didn't. The woman behind the cart moved with practiced efficiency, her hands quick and sure as she assembled bowls of noodles. She wore a simple white t-shirt and jeans, nothing remarkable, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Not the kind of attention his wealth demanded, but something quieter, more real. So this is what people are calling food these days? The words escaped before his brain could stop them, loud enough to carry over the street noise. Several people in line turned to look at him, their expressions shifting, from curiosity to recognition to something that might have been amusement. The woman, Zaira, looked up from the bowl she was preparing. Her eyes met his without flinching, without the subtle deference he was used to seeing when people realized who they were talking to. You hungry or just bored? Her voice was calm, matter of fact. No trace of intimidation or false friendliness. She asked the question like she genuinely wanted to know the answer, like his expensive suit and obvious wealth were just details, not defining characteristics. Corwin felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time someone had spoken to him like that? Like he was just another person instead of a walking net worth statement? I own 5 restaurants, he replied, his voice carrying the edge that made board members straighten in their chairs. None of them serve whatever this is. The line of customers had gone quiet, sensing drama. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside him, probably calculating the potential PR damage of his boss publicly mocking a street vendor. But Zaira just nodded once, her expression unchanged. Then maybe it's time you taste something real. The challenge in her tone wasn't aggressive or defensive. It was simply honest, as if she was pointing out an obvious truth he was too stubborn to see. Around them, the lunch crowd had formed an impromptu audience, office workers and construction crews united in their curiosity about what would happen next. Corwin felt the weight of their attention, the expectation that he would either back down or escalate. His entire life had been built on never backing down, on meeting every challenge with overwhelming force. But something about this woman's calm certainty made his usual tactics feel small. I'll pass, he said finally, the words tasting like defeat even as he spoke them. He turned and walked away, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete with each step. Behind him, he heard the normal sounds of the lunch crowd resuming, orders being placed, conversations picking up where they'd left off, the sizzle of food hitting hot oil. But he also heard something else. Laughter, not mocking or cruel, but warm, genuine, the kind of laughter that came from people who knew each other, who shared something more than just a transaction. Sir? Marcus was practically jogging to keep up. Should we head back to the office? Corwin didn't answer. His mind was replaying the encounter, analyzing it like market data. The woman's confidence, her complete lack of interest in impressing him, the way she'd looked at him, like she could see through the expensive facade to something he'd forgotten existed. In his world, everyone wanted something. Investors wanted returns, Employees wanted promotions. Women like Victoria wanted access to his social circle. But this street vendor, Zaira, had wanted nothing from him except an honest answer to a simple question. Are you hungry or just bored? The question followed him back to the office, through the afternoon meetings, past the conference calls with Tokyo and London. It was still there when he stood in his penthouse that evening, looking out at the city, lights, and trying to remember the last time he'd felt genuinely hungry for anything. Not the calculated hunger for market share, or the strategic appetite for acquisition targets. Real hunger. The kind that came from your body instead of your brain, that couldn't be satisfied with molecular gastronomy, or wine that cost more per bottle than most people made in a month. He thought about the smell from her cart, rich and complex and completely unpretentious. About the way her customers had waited patiently, like they knew they were getting something worth the time. About the laughter that had followed him down the street, warm and inclusive and utterly foreign to his carefully controlled world. For the first time in years, Corwin Dre couldn't sleep. And for the first time in his adult life, he wondered if everything he'd built was just an elaborate way of avoiding something real. Tomorrow, he would return to that cart. Tomorrow, everything would change. Corwin's penthouse felt like a museum at 3 a.m., 47 floors above the city, surrounded by art worth more than most people's houses. He paced between floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of everything he'd conquered. But conquest felt hollow when you couldn't sleep. The encounter with the street vendor played on repeat in his mind. Not just her words, but the way she'd said them. The complete absence of deference, the calm certainty that had made his usual intimidation tactics feel like playground bullying. You hungry or just bored? He'd built an empire on reading people, on understanding their motivations before they understood them themselves. But this woman, Zaira, had read him instead. Seen through the expensive suit and corporate armor to something he'd forgotten existed. Actual hunger. Corwin walked to his kitchen, all granite countertops and professional grade. Appliances that his personal chef used to prepare meals he barely tasted. He opened the Sub-Zero refrigerator, staring at containers of organic, this and artisanal that. Food designed to impress rather than satisfy. When had he last eaten something that wasn't a statement? The smell from her cart lingered in his memory. Rich, complex, honest. The kind of aroma that promised comfort instead of status, satisfaction instead of sophistication. By 6 a.m., he'd given up on sleep entirely. He showered, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, and tried to focus on the day ahead. Board meeting at 9. Conference call with London at 11, lunch with potential investors from Silicon Valley. But as Marcus briefed him on the morning's agenda during the drive downtown, Corwin found his attention drifting to the streets outside, to the people starting their day without assistants or drivers, without algorithms to predict their next move. Sir? Marcus was looking at him strangely. The board members are waiting. They were parked outside the promenade building, but Corwin's eyes were fixed on something else. A familiar red canopy 3 blocks down Peachtree Street, steam already rising, from a pot that promised something his 5 restaurants couldn't deliver. Reschedule the board meeting, he said suddenly. Tell them I'm dealing with a potential acquisition, something urgent. Marcus's fingers flew over his tablet, sending messages that would rearrange the schedules of Atlanta's most powerful people. But Corwin was already walking away, his Italian leather shoes clicking against concrete as he moved towards something he couldn't quite name. The morning crowd around Zaira's cart was different from yesterday's lunch rush. Office workers grabbing quick breakfasts, construction crews fueling up for long days, college students counting out exact change. But the atmosphere was the same, warm, genuine, real. Zaira looked up as he approached, her expression neutral. No surprise, no smugness, just the same calm assessment she'd given him yesterday. Small bowl, he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. She nodded once. One rule. You finish it before judging. She handed him chopsticks, actual chopsticks, not the disposable kind. His restaurants provided, and gestured toward a small bench nearby. Corwin walked over, suddenly aware that he was about to eat street food in a $3,000 suit. The bowl was simple. Noodles, broth, a few vegetables, nothing that would photograph well for Instagram or impress food critics. But the first bite stopped him cold. The broth was deep, layered with flavors that built on each other like a symphony: soy and star anise, ginger, and something else he couldn't identify. The noodles had texture, substance, the kind of chew that came from being made by hand instead of machine. It wasn't just food, it was conversation, the kind his father used to talk about before corporate success had made everything taste the same. Corwin found himself slowing down, actually tasting instead of consuming. The heat from the broth warmed something inside him that had been cold for longer than he cared to admit. This wasn't molecular gastronomy or fusion cuisine designed to impress food bloggers. This was comfort made visible, tradition passed down through generations of hands that understood what food was supposed to do. He looked back at Zaira, who was already helping the next customer. She moved with the kind of efficiency that came from loving what you did, from understanding that every bowl mattered to the person receiving it. There was no pretense, no performance, just the quiet satisfaction of doing something well. The businessman in him wanted to analyze it, to break down the ingredients and techniques, to understand how something so simple could be so effective. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for years, just wanted to sit on this bench and eat noodles made by someone who cared. Good. He looked up to find Zaira standing beside the bench, wiping her hands on a towel. Up close, he could see the small scar on her left hand, the calluses that came from real work, the kind of details that never appeared in the carefully curated world he inhabited. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like a restaurant review. It tastes like something my grandmother might have made. If I'd had a grandmother who cooked. Zaira smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. My father always said food should taste like home, even if you're eating it on a street corner. Your father taught you? Everything I know. He had a place in Chinatown before the developers came. Said the best recipes aren't written down. They're passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Corwin finished the last of the broth, surprised to find the bowl empty. When had he last finished an entire meal? When had he last eaten something without checking his phone or reviewing documents? What do I owe you? $5. He reached for his wallet, then paused. $5. He'd spent more than that on a single sip of wine at charity auctions. His lunch at Aria yesterday would have cost 60 times this amount, and he couldn't remember a single bite. Keep the change, he said, handing her a 20. Zaira shook her head. $5. That's the price. But, you want to tip me? Come back tomorrow. She walked back to her cart, leaving him holding the 20 like an idiot. Around him, the lunch crowd continued their routines, but something fundamental had shifted. The city looked the same, but he felt different. Lighter somehow, as if he'd been carrying weight he hadn't realized was there. As he walked back toward his office, Corwin found himself thinking about the conversation, not the business implications or market analysis, but the simple, human connection. When had he last talked to someone who didn't want anything from him? Who treated him like a person instead of a walking opportunity? His phone buzzed with messages from Marcus, from board members, from the carefully orchestrated world that demanded his attention. But for the first time in years, Corwin Dre wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or acquisition targets. He was thinking about tomorrow's lunch. Tuesday came with the same pre-dawn restlessness. Corwin found himself checking the weather. Clear skies, no chance of rain to disrupt street vendors. The thought surprised him. When had he started caring about weather patterns beyond their impact on his commute? The rescheduled board meeting is at 10, Marcus informed him as they rode the elevator down. And the Silicon Valley investors confirmed lunch at Canoe. Corwin nodded absently, his mind already 3 blocks away. Cancel Canoe. Tell them we'll meet at my office instead. Sir, they specifically requested. My office, Marcus. By 11:45, Corwin was walking down Peachtree Street again, ignoring the curious glances from his own employees who spotted him through office windows. The red canopy had become a beacon, drawing him away from conference rooms and quarterly projections towards something he couldn't quite define. The lunch crowd was building. Zaira moved behind her cart with the same fluid efficiency, but today, Corwin noticed details he'd missed before. The way she remembered each customer's preferences without writing anything down. How she adjusted spice levels based on subtle cues, a slight hesitation, a previous comment about sensitive stomachs. the genuine warmth in her voice when she asked about someone's sick mother or job interview. "Small bowl again?" she asked when he reached the front of the line. "Large this time." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, ladling the golden broth over fresh noodles with practiced precision. Today's garnish included something green he didn't recognize, herbs that added a brightness to the rich base. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to the unfamiliar leaves. "Thai basil. My father's secret ingredient. Said it made people remember why they fell in love with food in the first place." Corwin took the bowl to the same bench, but this time he wasn't alone. A construction worker sat at the other end, methodically working through his own portion while reading something on his phone. They nodded at each other, the universal acknowledgement of shared good taste. The second bowl was even better than the first. Maybe because he knew what to expect, or maybe because Zaira had adjusted the recipe slightly, adding layers of complexity that revealed themselves with each bite. The Thai basil provided a counterpoint to the rich broth, a brightness that kept the flavors from becoming heavy. Halfway through the meal, his phone rang. "Victoria. Darling, where are you? I'm at your office, and Marcus says you're in a meeting, but your calendar shows you're free." Corwin looked around, at the construction worker beside him, at the office workers standing in line, at Zaira efficiently serving bowl after bowl of something that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets. "I'm having lunch at Canoe. I thought we might somewhere else." He hung up before she could respond, then turned off the phone entirely. When had he last done that? When had he last chosen to be unreachable, even for an hour? Wednesday brought rain, the kind of summer downpour that sent most people scurrying for cover. Corwin stood in his office, watching water cascade down the windows, wondering if street vendors worked in weather like this. "Sir?" Marcus appeared with an umbrella. "The car is ready for lunch." But instead of heading to another climate-controlled restaurant, Corwin found himself walking through the rain toward Peachtree and Ellis. Most of the usual lunch crowd had taken shelter, but the red canopy was still there. Zaira, working under a makeshift extension that kept her cooking area dry. "You're crazy," she said when she saw him approaching, water dripping from his expensive suit. "Probably." She handed him a bowl, then gestured toward her truck parked nearby. "Get in before you drown." The truck's interior was cramped but warm, filled with the lingering aromas of spices and cooking oil. Zaira climbed into the driver's seat, shaking rain from her hair. "Most people don't come out in weather like this for street food. Most people don't make food worth getting wet for." She laughed, a sound that filled the small space with something Corwin hadn't heard in years. Genuine joy, unfiltered by social expectations or corporate politeness. "So what do you actually do?" she asked. "Besides own restaurants you apparently never eat at, I run a company. Data analytics. That sounds boring." "It is." The honesty surprised him. When had he last admitted that his work, his empire, his carefully constructed success might be anything less than fulfilling? They sat in comfortable silence, listening to rain drum against the truck's roof. Outside, Atlanta rushed past in a blur of umbrellas and hurried footsteps. But inside this small space, time moved differently. "Why do you do it?" Corwin asked. "The food cart, I mean. It can't be easy." Zaira was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around a thermos of tea. "My father used to say that cooking was the closest thing to magic he knew. You take simple ingredients, add time and care, and create something that makes people happy, something that connects them to memories, to each other, to home. And you believe that? I see it every day. Janet from the accounting firm, she comes here because her ex-husband never let her eat anything with flavor, said it was undignified. Marcus, the security guard, brings his partner soup when he's having a bad day with his diabetes. Mrs. Rodriguez teaches her grandson to use chopsticks here because it reminds her of teaching his father 20 years ago. Corwin thought about his own restaurants, with their carefully curated atmospheres and Instagram-worthy presentations. When had he last seen that kind of connection? When had food been about anything more than profit margins and Yelp reviews? Thursday, he brought clients. "This is highly irregular," said Patricia Chen, the venture capitalist from San Francisco, as they approached the food cart. "I was expecting something more traditional." "Trust me," Corwin said, though he wasn't entirely sure why he was doing this himself. The three investors, Patricia, James from Austin, and Robert from Boston, stood awkwardly in their expensive suits, clearly out of their element, but Zaira treated them with the same calm professionalism she showed. Everyone, explaining ingredients and asking about spice preferences. The broth base takes 12 hours, she told Patricia, who had asked about preparation time. No shortcuts. My father always said good food can't be rushed. As they ate, standing around a high table Zaira had set up nearby, something shifted in the conversation. The usual posturing and corporate speak gave way to something more genuine. James talked about his grandmother's cooking. Robert mentioned a noodle shop he'd discovered. In Tokyo, Patricia shared stories about growing up in her family's restaurant. This is remarkable, Patricia said, finishing her bowl. The depth of flavor, the technique. Where did you train? My father's kitchen, Zaira replied simply. After the clients left, with business cards exchanged and deals tentatively agreed upon, Corwin lingered. That was interesting, Zaira said, cleaning her equipment. They seemed surprised that good food doesn't require a Michelin star. They were. So was I, honestly. Why? Corwin considered the question. Because I've spent so long thinking that expensive meant better, that complicated meant superior. But this. He gestured toward the cart, the simple setup that had just impressed 3 of the most sophisticated palates in venture capital. This is just honest. Friday brought a realization that changed everything. Corwin arrived at his usual time, but the cart wasn't there. The corner looked empty, wrong somehow, like a stage missing its central prop. He stood there for several minutes, checking his watch, wondering if he'd gotten the time wrong. She's not coming today, said Tommy, the bike messenger, who sometimes helped during busy periods. Family emergency or something. The disappointment hit harder than it should have. It was just lunch, just one meal in a day full of options. But as Corwin walked back to his office, past restaurants that would welcome him with open arms and menus that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, he realized something fundamental had changed. He wasn't just coming for the food anymore. He was coming for her. The coffee shop on Ponce de Leon was nothing like the places Corwin usually frequented. No marble countertops or artisanal pour-overs, just mismatched furniture and the kind of worn comfort that came from years of genuine use. He'd suggested it after Zaira mentioned she lived nearby, though he'd never been inside before. You look different without the suit, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Corwin glanced down at his jeans and button-down shirt, clothes he'd had to dig out of the back of his closet. Different good, or different bad? Different human. It was Saturday evening, 3 weeks after their first encounter. 3 weeks of daily visits to her cart, of conversations that lasted longer each day, of a growing awareness that something was shifting in his carefully ordered world. So, this is where you come to escape the empire? Zaira asked, looking around at the eclectic mix of students, artists, and neighborhood regulars. I don't usually escape anywhere. This is actually my first time here. Then why suggest it? Because you mentioned it, because I wanted to see a place that mattered to you. The honesty surprised them both. In his world, every interaction was strategic, every conversation calculated for maximum advantage. But with Zaira, the corporate armor felt unnecessary, even counterproductive. Tell me about your father, he said, stirring sugar into coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of a lifestyle choice. Zaira's expression softened. He came here with nothing but recipes and determination, worked in other people's kitchens for 15 years, saving every penny to buy that cart. Said America was the only place where a man could feed people and call it success. And your mother? Died when I was 12. Cancer, same as him eventually. But those 3 years between her death and his diagnosis, those were the best years of my life. Just me and him, learning to cook, learning to dream. Corwin thought about his own father, a man who measured love in stock portfolios and quarterly reports. When had they last had a conversation that wasn't about business? What about you? Zaira asked. What did your father teach you? How to win, how to identify weakness and exploit it, how to turn every relationship into a transaction. Sounds lonely. It is. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Around them, the coffee shop hummed with the kind of authentic life Corwin had forgotten existed. Couples sharing desserts, students debating philosophy, friends laughing over inside jokes. Can I ask you something? Zaira said. Why do you keep coming back? And don't say it's just the food. Corwin considered lying, offering some corporate speak about market research or cultural exploration. But her directness demanded honesty in return. Because when I'm at your cart, I remember what it feels like to be hungry, really hungry, not just going through the motions of eating. And when you look at me, you don't see a net worth or a business opportunity. You see, I don't know what you see actually. I see someone who forgot how to enjoy things. Someone who built walls so high he can't see over them anymore. And that doesn't bother you? Should it? Everyone's got walls. The question is whether you want to climb over them or just keep building them higher. They walked through Centennial Park afterward, past families having picnics and couples sharing benches. The evening air was thick with summer heat and the distant sound of a jazz quartet playing near the fountain. I used to come here with my father, Zaira said, settling onto a bench overlooking the pond. Sunday afternoons, after the lunch rush, he'd bring leftover dumplings and we'd feed the ducks, even though you're not supposed to. Rebel. He said rules were for people who didn't understand the difference between right and wrong. Feeding hungry ducks was right, even if some signs said otherwise. Corwin thought about all the rules that governed his life, board meetings, and profit margins, social expectations and strategic alliances. When had he last done something simply because it felt right? What's your dream? He asked. Beyond the cart, I mean, a real restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood place where families can afford to eat together, where the recipes my father protected can feed more than just the lunch crowd. How close are you? Maybe 4 years if I'm careful with money, maybe 3 if I'm lucky. 4 years. Corwin spent more on wine in a month than she'd saved in 2 years of 12-hour days. The disparity should have felt normal. He was used to existing in a different economic universe than most people. But sitting beside her, watching her talk about dreams that required years of sacrifice, the gap felt obscene. 2 weeks later, she invited him to her apartment. It's not much, she warned, as they climbed the narrow stairs above the laundromat. And it probably smells like fabric softener. The apartment was tiny, a studio with a kitchenette, a bed that doubled as a couch, and windows that looked out onto Memorial Drive. But it was warm, lived in, filled with the kind of personal touches that made a space feel like home. Sit, she said, gesturing toward the bed while she moved around the small kitchen. And don't judge the decor. I'm not exactly working with a decorator's budget. But Corwin wasn't judging. He was marveling at the photographs covering one wall, her father in his chef's whites, family gatherings, moments of joy captured and preserved. At the small bookshelf filled with cookbooks in 3 languages, at the way she moved in the cramped space with the same efficiency she showed at the cart. What are you making? Dumplings. My father's recipe, the one he never wrote down. Took me 2 years to get them right after he died. She worked with practiced precision, rolling dough, filling each dumpling with a mixture that smelled like heaven. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from repetition, from love made visible through food. Can I help? You know how to fold dumplings. I can learn. She showed him the technique, how to pleat the edges, how to seal them properly, how to make something beautiful from simple ingredients. His first attempts were clumsy, lopsided things that made her laugh. They look like abstract art, she said, examining his handiwork. Expensive abstract art, the most expensive kind, made with good intentions and terrible execution. They cooked together in the tiny kitchen, bumping elbows and sharing stories. When the dumplings were ready, they sat on the bed with plates balanced, on their knees, eating food that tasted like tradition and possibility. This is the best meal I've ever had, Corwin said, and meant it. You need better friends. But as he looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built from nothing but determination and love, Corwin realized he was exactly where he needed to be. The boardroom felt different on Monday morning. Corwin noticed it the moment he walked in. The subtle shift in posture, the exchanged glances, the way conversation stopped just a beat too long when he entered. 12 of Atlanta's most powerful people sat around the mahogany table, but the atmosphere carried an undercurrent he couldn't quite identify. Gentlemen, ladies, he said, taking his usual seat at the head of the table. Let's discuss the quarterly projections. But instead of diving into spreadsheets and market analysis, board member Patricia Whitmore cleared her throat. At 63, she was old Atlanta money, the kind of woman who could trace her family's influence back to Reconstruction. Her opinion carried weight that went beyond her substantial investment in Ember Tech. "Corwin, before we begin, there's something we need to address." The tone was maternal but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. Around the table, other board members shifted in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their tablets and coffee cups. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Your recent behavioral changes, the canceled meetings, the unconventional lunch locations, the general shift in your professional demeanor." Corwin felt his jaw tighten. "I wasn't aware my lunch choices were board business." "They are, when they affect company perception," said Richard Blackstone, the real estate mogul who'd helped finance Ember Tech's early expansion. "Atlanta's business community is small, Corwin. People talk about what, exactly?" Patricia leaned forward, her expression carefully neutral. "About you eating at food carts, about bringing potential investors to street vendors instead of established restaurants, about the questions it raises regarding your judgment." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Corwin looked around the table, seeing concern mixed with something that might have been disappointment. These people had made him rich, had trusted him with their money and their reputations. Now they were questioning his fitness to lead. "My judgment built this company," he said quietly. "My judgment made all of you considerably wealthier. And we're grateful," said James Morrison, the tech veteran who'd joined the board 2 years ago. "But leadership isn't just about financial returns. It's about maintaining the kind of image that inspires confidence in clients, investors, employees." "What image would that be?" "Stability, predictability, the assurance that our CEO isn't going through some kind of midlife crisis." The phrase stung more than it should have. Corwin had built his reputation on being unflappable, on making decisions based on data rather than emotion. But these past weeks with Zaira had awakened something he'd thought was dead. The ability to act on instinct, to choose connection over calculation. "I'm 32, he said. "Hardly midlife." "Age isn't the issue," Patricia replied. "Behavior is. You've missed 3 board meetings in the past month. You've turned down speaking engagements that would have generated significant publicity. You've been distracted. I've been exploring new perspectives on business development." "By eating noodles on street corners?" The dismissive tone in Richard's voice triggered something protective in Corwin's chest. These people had never tasted Zaira's cooking, had never seen the community she'd built, had never witnessed the kind of authentic success that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. By understanding what real customer service looks like, by learning from someone who's built genuine loyalty without focus groups or marketing budgets. "Corwin," Patricia's voice carried the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "We understand the appeal of authenticity, but there's a difference between market research and personal involvement. And frankly, your recent choices suggest the latter." The accusation was subtle but clear. They knew about Zaira, or at least suspected. In their world, everything was connected. Social circles, business relationships, the invisible networks that determined who succeeded and who failed. "My personal life is exactly that. Personal. Not when you're the face of a billion-dollar company," James said. "Not when your decisions affect shareholder value and employee confidence. We have a responsibility to protect this company's reputation." "From what?" "From the perception that our CEO has lost focus, that he's making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy." Corwin stood, walking to the windows that offered a view of the city he'd conquered. Somewhere down there, Zaira was setting up her cart, preparing to feed people who appreciated what she offered without questioning her credentials or analyzing her market position. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Refocus," Patricia said. "Remember what made you successful. The discipline, the strategic thinking, the ability to separate business from pleasure. And if I don't?" The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Richard spoke. "The board has fiduciary responsibilities, Corwin. To shareholders, to employees, to the company's future. If we believe leadership is compromised," the threat was implicit but unmistakable. They could remove him, had the votes to do it if they acted together. The empire he'd built could be taken away by the same people who'd helped him create it. "I see. We hope you do," Patricia said, her tone softening slightly. "You're brilliant, Corwin. You've achieved more by 32 than most people accomplish in a lifetime. But success requires sacrifice. It always has. After the meeting, Corwin sat alone in his office, staring at the city below. The board's message was clear. Choose between the life he'd built and the woman who'd shown him what life could be. Between the empire that defined him and the connection that had redefined him. His phone buzzed with a text from Zaira. Trying a new recipe today. Thai basil and lemongrass. Come hungry. The simple message made him smile, then immediately feel guilty for smiling. How had his life become so complicated that happiness felt like betrayal? He thought about the board's concerns, their warnings about perception and reputation. They weren't wrong. His behavior had changed. His priorities had shifted. But was that necessarily bad? When had maintaining an image become more important than being authentic? Another text arrived. This one from Victoria. Dinner tonight? The Ritz has a new chef. The contrast was stark. Victoria represented everything his world expected. Beauty, breeding, the kind of woman who looked perfect in society photos and never challenged his assumptions. Zaira represented everything his world feared. Unpredictability, authenticity, the dangerous possibility that there might be more to life than quarterly profits. Corwin closed his eyes, remembering the taste of dumplings made with love in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. Remembering the way Zaira looked at him like he was worth knowing, not just worth using. But he also remembered the faces around the boardroom table, the concern mixed with disappointment. The implicit threat that everything he'd worked for could disappear if he made the wrong choice. For the first time since building his empire, Corwin Dre felt truly afraid, not of losing money or market share, but of losing himself in the process of trying to keep both worlds happy. The afternoon stretched ahead, filled with meetings and decisions that would shape the company's future. But all he could think about was a woman stirring soup under a red canopy, creating something real in a world that had forgotten what real meant. The photograph appeared on Atlanta Business Journal's website at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. Corwin, caught mid-laugh at Zaira's cart, looking more relaxed than he had in any corporate headshot. The headline read, Embertech CEO's unusual lunch habits raise questions. By 8 a.m., the story had been picked up by 3 local news stations. By noon, it was trending on social media with hashtags that ranged from amusing to cruel. Street food CEO, hashtag billionaire slumming, love or publicity. Corwin first learned about it from Marcus, who burst into his office with the kind of panic usually reserved for hostile takeovers or SEC investigations. Sir, we have a situation. The tablet Marcus thrust at him showed a collage of photos. Corwin at the cart, walking, with Zaira through Centennial Park, sitting in the coffee shop on Ponce de Leon. Someone had been following them, documenting their relationship with the patience of a professional stalker. How did they get these? Unknown. But sir, it gets worse. The second article was from Atlanta Magazine's gossip column, written with the kind of breathless speculation that turned private lives into public entertainment. Sources close to the Embertech board suggest CEO Corwin Dre's recent erratic behavior may be linked to a romantic relationship with a street vendor. The unnamed woman, who operates a food cart in downtown Atlanta, represents a dramatic departure from Dre's usual social circle. Corwin's phone started ringing before he finished reading. Victoria, his mother, board members, reporters who'd somehow gotten his direct number. Each call brought the same mixture of concern, curiosity, and barely concealed judgment. Turn it off, he told Marcus, who was fielding calls on 3 different lines. All of it. No comments, no statements, nothing. But the silence only made things worse. By afternoon, the story had evolved from business curiosity to full-blown scandal. Entertainment blogs picked it up, adding their own speculation about the mystery woman who'd captured Atlanta's most eligible bachelor. The worst part was watching them discover Zaira's identity. It started with a food blogger who recognized the cart from previous reviews. Then someone found her name on the city's vendor permits. Within hours, they had her address, her background, photos of her father's old restaurant before it closed. Zaira Chen, 28, operates Chen's Noodles from a cart on Peachtree Street, read the updated article. The daughter of immigrants, Chen has no formal culinary training and lives in a studio apartment above a laundromat. Sources suggest the relationship began when Dre started frequenting her cart several weeks ago. The tone was subtle but unmistakable. She was beneath him, an oddity, a temporary fascination for a man who could afford anything he wanted. They didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. What could a billionaire possibly see in a street vendor except novelty? Corwin tried calling Zaira, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He drove to her corner, but the cart wasn't there. For the first time in weeks, Peachtree and Ellis felt empty, wrong, like a stage missing its most important performer. The media attention intensified over the next 2 days. Photographers camped outside Ember Tech's offices, hoping to catch Corwin leaving for another unconventional lunch. Entertainment reporters staked out Zaira's apartment building, turning her neighbors into unwilling sources for quotes about the quiet girl who kept to herself. The coverage grew increasingly invasive. They found her father's obituary, turned his struggle with cancer into a sob story designed to explain her desperation for a wealthy boyfriend. They interviewed former customers, twisting innocent comments about good food into speculation about her ambitions and motivations. She always seemed nice enough, one office worker told Channel 2 News. But you have to wonder what she's really after, you know? I mean, guys like that don't usually date girls like her unless there's an angle. The worst article appeared in the Atlanta Constitution's lifestyle section, written by a society columnist who'd never eaten at a food cart inn. Her life, while we applaud Mr. Dre's adventurous palate, one has to question the wisdom of such a public relationship with someone so far outside his social sphere. Atlanta's business community thrives on stability and predictability. This kind of experimentation raises questions about judgment that extend far beyond personal choices. Corwin read it twice, his anger building with each carefully crafted insult. They were attacking Zaira for the crime of being authentic, for building something real instead of inheriting something artificial. They were reducing their relationship to a publicity stunt or a midlife crisis, unable to comprehend that he might genuinely care about someone who didn't come from their world. His phone rang. Patricia Whitmore. Corwin, we need to talk. If this is about the articles, it's about damage control. The board is meeting this afternoon. Emergency session. I'll be there. Actually, we think it might be better if you weren't. Let us handle the initial response. Craft a statement that protects both you and the company. The dismissal stung. They were managing him like a crisis, treating his personal life like a PR problem that required professional intervention. What kind of statement? Something that clarifies the situation, explains that this was a brief exploration of local business practices, market research essentially, nothing serious or long-term. You want me to lie? I want you to protect what you've built, what we've all built together. After hanging up, Corwin sat in his office, watching the city move below him. Somewhere down there, Zaira was dealing with reporters and photographers, having her life dissected by people who'd never bothered to taste her food or understand her dreams. He thought about calling her again, but what would he say? That he was sorry? That he hadn't expected this? That he was willing to fight for them against his own board, his own world, his own carefully constructed life? The truth was more complicated. Part of him was sorry that she was being hurt, sorry that their private moments had been turned into public entertainment. But another part of him was calculating the damage, measuring the cost to his reputation, his company, his future. The board was right about one thing. He had responsibilities beyond his personal happiness. Employees who depended on Ember Tech for their livelihoods, investors who'd trusted him with their money, a company that bore his name and reputation. But as he stared at the latest headline, Billionaire's street food romance, love or publicity stunt, Corwin realized the media had asked the wrong question. The real question wasn't whether their relationship was genuine. The real question was whether he was brave enough to defend it. And for the first time in his life, Corwin Dre wasn't sure he knew the answer. Zaira's apartment building was under siege. News vans lined Memorial Drive, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters clutched coffee cups and checked their phones, waiting for any sign of the woman who'd become Atlanta's most talked about mystery. Corwin parked 3 blocks away and walked, pulling his baseball cap low over his face. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was sneaking through his own city to see the woman he cared about, hiding from cameras that treated their relationship like a circus act. The back entrance to the building was mercifully clear. He climbed the narrow stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding with something that felt like fear. He'd faced hostile takeovers and SEC investigations with less anxiety than he felt approaching Zaira's door. He knocked softly. "Zaira, it's me." Silence. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate. The door opened just wide enough for her to see him, her face pale and drawn in a way that made his chest tighten. "You shouldn't be here. I needed to see you. To explain." "Explain what? How you've been hiding me for weeks. How you never mentioned that dating you would turn my life into a reality show." She opened the door wider, but her posture remained defensive, arms crossed over the same white t-shirt she'd worn the day they met. The apartment looked the same, but the atmosphere had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something colder, more guarded. "I didn't know this would happen. Didn't you?" Zaira moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the media circus below. "You're one of the most recognizable people in Atlanta. You didn't think someone might notice you slumming it with the help? Don't say that. You know that's not what this is." "Do I? Because I've been reading the articles, Corwin. I've seen what your world thinks of me. Ambitious street vendor, social climber, temporary fascination. Is that what I am to you?" The pain in her voice cut deeper than any board meeting or hostile headline. Corwin stepped closer, wanting to touch her, to somehow bridge the distance that had opened between them. "You know better than that." "I thought I did. But then I started thinking about all our conversations, all the times you could have mentioned your world, your responsibilities. The fact that being seen with me might destroy everything you've built. It won't destroy anything, won't it?" Zaira turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your board is meeting right now, isn't it? Deciding how to handle the Corwin problem. How to spin this so it doesn't hurt the company." The accuracy of her guess hit like a physical blow. How did she know? Had she been reading the business blogs, following the speculation about emergency board meetings and damage control? "They're concerned about perception. They're concerned about you dating beneath your station, about what it says about your judgment, your fitness to lead. And you know what? Maybe they're right." "Zaira, no, listen to me. I've been thinking about this for 3 days, ever since the first article appeared, about what you said that night in my apartment, about how this was the best meal you'd ever had, about how you needed better friends." She moved to the small kitchen, her hands gripping the counter like an anchor. "I realized something. You don't need better friends, Corwin. You need to decide who you actually are." "What do you mean? Are you the man who comes to my cart every day, who laughs at my jokes and helps me fold dumplings? Or are you the CEO who owns 5 restaurants and sits on charity boards and dates pharmaceutical heiresses?" "I'm both." "No, you're not. Because those 2 men want different things, live in different worlds, have different values. And for the past few weeks, you've been pretending they can coexist." Corwin felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They can. We can make this work." "How? By hiding? By pretending I don't exist when it's convenient? By letting your board craft statements that reduce our relationship to market research?" The last accusation hit home. How did she know about the board's suggestion? Had someone leaked it, or was she just that good at reading the situation? "I haven't agreed to any statements. But you haven't refused them either, have you?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, a reporter was doing a live broadcast, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Questions about the CEO's judgment continue to mount as Embertech's stock price shows signs of volatility. "They're talking about your company on the news," Zaira said quietly, "about how this is affecting your business, your reputation, your future. And you know what I realized? You care more about that than you do about me. That's not true, isn't it? When you had to choose between bringing me into your world or keeping me separate from it, what did you choose? When your board started asking questions, did you defend me or start calculating damage control?" Corwin opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. He had been calculating, measuring, trying to find a way to keep both worlds happy without fully committing to either. "I fell for the man who kept coming back for noodles," Zaira continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Not the CEO who needs the world's approval. But I don't think that man actually exists. I think he was just another role you were playing. That's not fair." "Fair?" Zaira laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been telling me who you really were from the beginning. Fair would have been preparing me for what dating you would mean. Fair would have been choosing me over your image when it mattered. She moved toward the door, her message clear. I can't compete with an empire, Corwin. I can't fight a whole world that thinks I'm not good enough for you, and I won't ask you to choose between me and everything you've built. What if I want to choose? Do you? Really? Or do you just want to find a way to have both without paying the price for either? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Corwin looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman who'd changed his life, who'd shown him what authentic success looked like, who'd made him remember what it felt like to be hungry for something real. But he also heard the voices of his board, felt the weight of responsibilities and expectations, saw the empire he'd built threatening to crumble over a relationship the world couldn't understand. I need time to think. Zaira nodded, her expression sad but unsurprised. That's what I thought you'd say. She opened the door gently, not slamming it, not making a scene, just closing it with the quiet finality of someone who'd already said goodbye. Corwin stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the building, televisions, conversations, the ordinary life of people who didn't have to choose between love and legacy. Then he walked back down the stairs, past the reporters who didn't recognize him without his suit, toward a car that would take him back to a world that suddenly felt like a prison of his own making. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum at 3 a.m. Corwin stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, 47 floors above the city he'd conquered, watching Atlanta sleep beneath a blanket of lights. But for the first time since building his empire, the view brought no satisfaction, no sense of achievement, only the hollow echo of Zaira's words. You care more about that than you do about me. His reflection stared back from the glass, expensive suit wrinkled from a day of crisis, meetings, tie loosened, the carefully maintained facade finally showing cracks. Behind him, the apartment stretched like a monument to success that suddenly felt meaningless. The emergency board meeting had gone exactly as expected. Damage control strategies, carefully worded statements, a planted distance. Him from the situation until public interest moved on to the next scandal. Patricia Whitmore had been particularly eloquent about protecting the company's reputation. This will pass, she'd assured him. These things always do. But we need to show stability, consistency. The market responds to predictability. They'd crafted a statement together, clinical and corporate. Mr. Dre's recent exploration of local business practices was part of ongoing market research. Any personal relationships that may have developed were incidental and brief. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Corwin walked to his desk, where the unsigned statement waited alongside quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. Documents that represented everything he'd worked for, everything that defined him in the eyes of the world. But as he stared at the papers, all he could see was Zaira's face. The disappointment in her eyes when she realized he'd been calculating their relationship like a business transaction. The quiet dignity with which she'd closed the door, not slamming it in anger but shutting it with the finality of someone who'd already grieved what they were losing. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria saw the news. Call me when you're ready to get back to normal. Normal. The word felt foreign now, like a language he'd once spoken fluently, but had somehow forgotten. What was normal? Board meetings and charity galas? Restaurants where the wine cost more than most people's rent? Relationships based on social compatibility rather than genuine connection? He thought about the past few weeks. The daily visits to Zaira's cart, the conversations that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share, the way she'd looked at him like he was worth knowing rather than worth using. For the first time in years, he'd felt hungry for something real, and he'd thrown it away to protect an image. Corwin picked up the unsigned statement, reading the corporate speak that reduced the most authentic relationship of his life to incidental and brief. The words were technically accurate. Their relationship had been brief, and from the board's perspective, it was certainly incidental to business operations. But it wasn't true. Nothing about Zaira had been incidental. She'd changed him, challenged him, shown him what life looked like when you stripped away the performance and just existed as yourself. He crumpled the statement and threw it in the trash. Then he opened his laptop and began typing a different kind of message. The email went out at 4:17 a.m. to every major news outlet in Atlanta, every business publication that had covered the story. Every reporter who'd turned his personal life into public entertainment. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Ember Tech to pursue other opportunities. The company will be led by our exceptional board of directors, while a search for permanent leadership is conducted. Recent media coverage has focused on my personal relationships and their impact on business operations. Let me be clear, my relationship with Zaira Chen was not a publicity stunt, market research, or temporary fascination. It was the most genuine connection I've experienced in my adult life. Ms. Chen is a remarkable woman who has built something authentic and meaningful. Through hard work, dedication, and genuine care for her community, the media's portrayal of her as anything less than extraordinary reflects poorly on our society's values, not on her character. I take full responsibility for failing to protect her from the scrutiny that comes with being associated with me. That failure is mine alone. Ember Tech will continue to thrive under new leadership. As for me, I'm learning that true success isn't measured by quarterly reports or stock prices, but by the connections we make and the lives we touch. I wish Ms. Chen nothing but happiness and success in all her future endeavors. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response was immediate and explosive. His phone started ringing within minutes. Board members, reporters, business partners, who couldn't believe he'd just walked away from a billion-dollar empire. Marcus arrived at the penthouse by 6 a.m., pale and shaking. "Sir, what have you done?" "What I should have done weeks ago. The board is furious. They're talking about lawsuits, breach of fiduciary duty." "Let them talk. I'm done performing for other people's expectations." By noon, the story had gone national. Billionaire CEO steps down for love. Atlanta executive chooses heart over empire. The most expensive breakup in business history. But Corwin wasn't reading the headlines. He was sitting in his empty office, boxing up personal items, while his former employees whispered in the hallways. Some looked at him with pity, others with confusion, a few with something that might have been respect. "You really did it," said James Morrison, appearing in the doorway. "You actually walked away." "I did. For a woman who won't even take your calls. For the chance to become someone worth her time." James shook his head. "I hope she's worth it." Corwin looked out the window one last time at the city below, at the streets, where Zaira moved through her life with purpose and authenticity. She is. The question is whether I can become worth her. 3 months after walking away from Ember Tech, Corwin stood in an empty storefront on Auburn Avenue, surrounded by sawdust and possibility. The space was nothing special, 1,200 square feet of worn hardwood floors, and brick walls that had housed a dozen failed businesses over the past decade. But it had something his 5 upscale restaurants had never possessed: potential for authenticity. "You sure about this location?" asked Tommy, the bike messenger who'd become an unlikely friend and business advisor. "It's not exactly the trendy part of town." Corwin ran his hand along the exposed brick, feeling the texture of something real and unpolished. "That's exactly why it's perfect." The neighborhood was a mix of old Atlanta and new dreams: historic buildings housing art studios and community centers, young families renovating shotgun houses, immigrants opening small businesses that served their communities rather than tourists. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' names and success was measured in relationships rather than revenue. "What are you thinking for the concept?" Tommy asked, pulling out a notebook where he'd been sketching layout ideas. "Simple. Good food, fair prices, no pretense. A place where families can afford to eat together, where the recipes matter more than the presentation." It was the opposite of everything Corwin had built before. His previous restaurants had been exercises in exclusivity, reservation lists, celebrity, chefs, wine collections that required sommelier expertise to navigate. They'd been successful because they made people feel special for being able to afford them. This would be different. This would be about inclusion rather than exclusion, community rather than status. The renovation took 6 weeks. Corwin worked alongside the contractors, learning to install light, fixtures and sand tables, discovering muscles he'd forgotten he had. His hands, once soft from years of boardroom meetings, developed calluses from real work. "You know you could hire people to do this," said Maria Santos, the local contractor, who'd taken pity on his amateur efforts and taught him basic carpentry. "I could, but then it wouldn't be mine, would it?" The design was deliberately simple. Mismatched tables and chairs bought from estate sales and thrift stores, each piece carrying its own history. Local artists' work on the walls, available for purchase at prices the artists set themselves. An open kitchen where diners could watch their food being prepared. Where cooking became performance art rather than hidden mystery. The menu was the hardest part. Corwin had hired Elena Rodriguez, a chef who'd trained at Le Cordon Bleu, but chose to cook for her community rather than chase Michelin stars. Together, they crafted dishes that honor tradition while remaining accessible, comfort food, elevated by technique but not by price. What about the name? Elena asked during one of their late-night planning sessions. Corwin had known from the beginning, though he'd been afraid to say it out loud. Zaira's Table? Elena raised an eyebrow. The woman from the food cart? The one all over the news? She taught me what food could be when it's made with love instead of ambition. This place exists because of what she showed me. Does she know? No. And she probably won't approve. But it's not about her approval. It's about honoring what she represents. The restaurant opened on a Tuesday in October, with no fanfare or publicity campaign. Word spread through the neighborhood organically. Maria telling her construction crew, Elena's family. Bringing friends, Tommy posting on social media about the billionaire who learned to cook. The first week was chaos. Orders backed up, servers learning the system, Corwin burning himself on the grill while trying to help during the dinner rush. But something magical happened in the midst of the confusion. Community. Mrs. Washington from the corner house brought her grandchildren for dinner and stayed to help fold napkins when she saw they were overwhelmed. College students from nearby Clark Atlanta University discovered they could afford to eat there regularly and started treating it like their cafeteria. Local business owners began holding informal meetings over coffee and Elena's homemade pastries. This is what I was trying to create, Corwin told Tommy one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly busy night. Not just a restaurant, but a gathering place. Think she'll come? Corwin had wondered the same thing. Zaira's cart still operated 3 miles away on Peachtree Street, though he'd heard through the neighborhood network that business had actually improved after the media attention. Apparently, controversy was good for noodle sales. I don't know. Part of me hopes she does, part of me hopes she doesn't. Why wouldn't you want her to see this? Corwin looked around the dining room, at the families finishing dinner, at the art students, sketching in the corner, at the quiet contentment that filled the space like warmth. Because if she comes, I'll have to face whether I've actually changed or just found a more sophisticated way to perform. The restaurant was successful by any measure that mattered. Full tables, happy customers, a staff that felt like family. But success felt incomplete without the approval of the woman who'd inspired it. 3 weeks after opening, on a rainy Thursday evening when the dinner rush had slowed to a comfortable hum, the door chimed. Corwin looked up from the register and felt his heart stop. Zaira stood in the doorway, arms crossed, water dripping from her jacket, looking around the space that bore her name with an expression he couldn't read. Zaira stood in the doorway like a question mark, her dark hair damp from the October rain, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the restaurant that bore her name. The dinner crowd had thinned to a comfortable murmur, families finishing dessert, students nursing, coffee over textbooks, the kind of authentic community Corwin had dreamed of creating. "You didn't ask my permission," she said finally, her voice carrying across the dining room. Conversations paused, heads turned. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, sensing drama but not understanding its source. Corwin felt his chest tighten, the same fear he'd experienced walking away from Ember Tech, but magnified. "Didn't need it," he replied, stepping out from behind the register. "You gave me the recipe that changed everything. You think one bowl of noodles made you a new man?" The challenge in her tone was familiar, the same directness that had first attracted and terrified him. But now, instead of triggering his defensive instincts, it made him smile. "No, you did." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Around them, the restaurant continued its gentle hum. Elena calling orders from the kitchen, servers refilling water glasses, the comfortable sounds of a place that had found its rhythm. Zaira moved deeper into the dining room, her eyes taking in details he'd agonized over. The mismatched furniture that prioritized comfort over aesthetics. The local artwork priced for actual purchase rather than investment. The open kitchen where cooking became conversation rather than performance. "This isn't what I expected," she said, running her fingers along a table made from reclaimed wood. What did you expect? Another monument to your ego. Expensive everything, impossible reservations, the kind of place that makes people feel lucky to spend too much money. I used to build those. This is different. Why? The question was simple, but the answer was everything. Corwin looked around the space he'd created, at the community that had formed organically around shared meals and honest prices. Because you taught me the difference between feeding people and impressing them, because I finally understood what my father never did. That success isn't about what you can afford to exclude, but what you choose to include. Zaira moved to the wall where Elena's menu was displayed in simple chalk lettering. No molecular gastronomy or fusion confusion, just honest descriptions of food made with care. Prices that reflected value rather than status. Elena Rodriguez. She read from the chef's signature. I know her work. She could be cooking anywhere, making 3 times what you're probably paying her. She chooses to cook here. Says it reminds her why she became a chef in the first place. And you? What does this remind you of? Corwin joined her at the menu board, close enough to smell the rain in her hair, to see the small scar on her hand that came from years of real work. It reminds me of sitting in your truck during that thunderstorm, of eating dumplings in your apartment, and realizing I'd never tasted anything made with love before. Of the way you looked at me like I was worth knowing instead of worth using. Past tense? Present tense. You still look at me like that, even when you're angry. Zaira turned to face him fully, her expression softening slightly. I'm not angry. I'm confused. 3 months ago, you chose your empire over everything else. Now you've built this place, walked away from billions, put my name on a restaurant I never asked for. What am I supposed to think? Think that I finally learned the difference between having everything and having something that matters. And what matters? This. He gestured around the restaurant, at the families sharing meals, at the students finding affordable comfort, at the community that had formed around the simple act of feeding people well. And you. Especially you. The confession was quieter than he'd intended, but it carried across the space between them like a promise. Zaira's eyes searched his face, looking for the calculation she'd learned to expect, the performance that had defined their relationship before. You really did it, she said finally. You actually changed. I'm trying to, every day. Why? Because the man you fell for, the one who kept coming back for noodles, he was real. He was just buried under years of other people's expectations. This place, walking away from Ember Tech, learning to cook with my hands. Instead of managing with spreadsheets, it's all about finding him again. Zaira was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the restaurant. That had become his love letter to everything she'd taught him. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. You know I can't compete with an empire. You don't have to. There is no empire anymore. There's just this place, this community, and the hope that maybe you'll let me earn my way back into your life. How? One meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one day at a time, until you believe that the man standing here is the same one who helped you fold dumplings in your kitchen. Zaira smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her since the media storm began. It transformed her face, brought back the warmth that had first made him forget about quarterly reports and board meetings. I suppose I could try the food, she said. See if you've learned anything about what really matters. Elena. Corwin called toward the kitchen. 2 bowls of the noodle soup. Make them perfect. As they waited for their meal, sitting across from each other at a table made from reclaimed wood, Corwin felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not the hollow satisfaction of corporate success, but the genuine contentment that came from building something real with someone who mattered. So, Zaira said, settling into her chair, tell me about this place. Tell me what you've learned. And for the first time in his life, Corwin Dre had a story worth telling. The moral was simple, written in every detail of the restaurant around them. True success isn't measured by what you can afford to exclude, but by what you choose to include. Love grows not in the spaces between worlds, but in the courage to build a new world together. And sometimes, the most valuable thing you can do is walk away from everything. You thought you wanted to find everything you actually need. Stories like Corwin and Zaira's remind us that real transformation happens when we choose authenticity over approval, connection over status, We all face moments where we must decide between what others expect and what our hearts know is right. What's your story? Have you ever walked away from something that looked perfect on paper to chase something that felt real in your heart? Drop a comment below and share your journey. Your courage might inspire someone else to make their own leap of faith. And if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of love, transformation, and the beautiful mess of choosing what matters over what's easy. Because the best stories aren't just told, they're lived, shared, and celebrated together. Your story matters. We're here to listen,